Would you like to find out how to replicate blocks from a quilt or other project? Or maybe you just want to learn how to make this simple basket block. In this video, I'll show you how to draft a pattern using this 6-inch basket block as an example. You'll also get some tips for constructing this square. If you're not interested in drafting your own block, but you'd like to learn how to make this basket, you can download these free directions at learnhowtoquilt.com. You'll find them under the Quilt Class tab. Scroll down to the Sampler Quilt. If you want to follow along, you'll need 1/4-inch graph paper, a ruler, and a sharp pencil. First, measure the block you want to copy. This is 6 inches by 6 inches. I drew this 6-inch square out on my graph paper using a marker so you can see. There's so many different ways to replicate this design, but I think the easiest is to just measure each space. So I see a square here that's 2 inches by 2 inches. I see another one down here, 2 inches by 2 inches. So I'll draw those in. I also notice that there's a diagonal that goes from this point here to here, and there's another one that goes from this edge to this edge. So I drew those in. This line at the edge of the square goes all the way to here, and this one comes across, and that's where they meet. So I'll draw that in. To draw this handle, you can use a lid or a circle template or a protractor if you have one handy. I'll use my ruler to find the center point of this basket. Put a little notch there. Line up your template and trace. Double check your measurements and then add straight of grain marks in each one of the corners. These are to remind you, whenever possible, you want to keep that straight of grain on the outside edge so as to keep your block nice and flat. At this point, you can start adding these seam allowances to make templates for your hand or machine sewing, but that's not the focus of this video. We're going to be looking at some quick cutting and sewing methods. I've cleaned up my pattern on the computer to make it a little bit easier to explain how to get your cutting measurements. First, we'll look at these squares. They measure 2 inches when finished. If I add a 1/4-inch seam allowance all the way around, that's a 1/4 inch plus 2 inches plus another 1/4 inch, then you'll need to cut 2 2.5-inch squares. Next, we'll look at these triangles. Both have 2 2-inch sides. If you put those two together, they'll form a square. So we can use the half square triangle formula. In the past, we've added 1 inch, but that 1 inch allows us to cut the square down after it's been formed. In this case, you won't be making a square with these two triangles. And so when you add 7/8 of an inch, that gives you a more true measurement to what size your triangle should be. So you'll add 7/8 to the finished size and you get 2 7/8 inch. So you'll cut 1 square at 2 7/8 inches, and then you'll cut that on the diagonal. This triangle on the top and this one on the bottom both measure 4 inches. So I can use the same formula, add 7/8 to the finished size, and cut 1 square at 4 7/8 inches, and then cut it on the diagonal, and I'll get 2 triangles. The same is true of this triangle. It measures 2 plus 2 makes 4, so it's 4 inches and 4 inches. I'll add 7/8 inch to the finished size. I come up with 4 7/8 inches. I'll cut 1 square at 4 7/8 inches, and then I'll cut it on the diagonal. You'll end up getting 2 triangles, but you only need 1. I can save the extra one for a later project or make another basket. Use your pattern as a reference to lay out your block. You want to sew straight seams, so try to divide your block into sections that require straight line sewing. Here's one section, another section, and another section. Before I sew these two sections together, I want to get my basket handle on. You can place your fabric over your pattern on top of a light box to trace your handle, or if you don't have a light box, take your pattern and fabric, tape it up on a window, and then trace. You'll probably need about 8 inches of trim to go around your handle. You can either sew this by hand or sew it by machine, whichever you prefer. Since this trim has to go around a curve, you want to make sure that your trim will stretch. Rickrack will take that curve pretty easily. Unlike trim like this, if you go to try to stretch it, it won't go around that curve. So be careful. It's okay if you decide not to put a basket handle and just leave it plain. Or you might decide to make a fusible applique to put inside your basket. Just remember that you do have seam allowance up here, so you don't want your flower or your handle to go up within that 1/4 inch seam. After adding your basket handle, you want to sew these 2 triangles together. Both of these edges are on the bias, so gently guide this through your machine. Carefully press the seams in this direction. Next, you'll sew these units. Put right sides together, and I'm going to clip the seams that need to be sewn because these are very confusing. I want to show you that both of these pieces look identical, but on one of these you'll sew on this side, and on the other one you'll sew on this side. These pieces are mirror images. If you sew both of them the same, it won't work. When I took this over to the machine, I made sure to line up this edge. You'll have these little ears here. Don't worry about that. Some people like to clip them off, but I save them till the very end. After sewing, I press these legs as the arrow shows. Following the pattern, this unit gets sewn to this unit. Remember, we're looking for straight line sewing. Here's another straight line to sew. Put right sides together, making sure to line up this edge. There's going to be an ear, a little extra ear here, a little extra ear here. I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just worried about lining up this edge. Take it to the sewing machine and I'll sew my 1/4 inch seam. After sewing, I follow the arrow and I press my seams in that direction. Next, I'll take this piece, put right sides together, and stitch. After sewing, I press this seam in that direction. That's the way it wants to lay. I know it says that you should press in this direction, but this last seam, it doesn't make a difference. The only concern I have is that maybe if this basket is dark and this is really light fabric, that the basket would show up here. So you want to press this way. Now you're ready to add this last piece. Before I go any further, I like to find the midpoint. I find it easiest just to fold the triangle in half and then press, so you don't have to put any marks on your fabric. Here's the midpoint, and when I put right sides together, this midpoint should match up with this point. Get these edges lined up. I'll pull this back to see if I'm right on that point. It looks like I have to go over just a little. And then I'll pin. Now be careful because all of this is bias. And I'll pin. Let's turn it over on the other side and look. On this side I have this X where that triangle point is. I want to make sure that I sew one thread over. So it might be better to start out on this side sewing. One of the reasons why I like leaving these tips on is usually a 1/4 inch seam begins right here. So if I put this up my sewing machine and I start sewing, I should come onto my fabric right at that V. It's just another way of double checking my stitches. Let me get this pin out. Just like before, a 1/4 inch over to be right in this crevice. Let's open this block and you can see a nice sharp tip. Here's my completed block. I can rotary cut these off, or I like to just use the scissors. Don't forget, you'll have some on the inside also that you want to clip off. This basket is the last block in our Saturday Sampler series. If you've been following along, you should have enough squares for a small wall hanging. In the next video, you'll find out about choosing a setting for your blocks. Thanks for visiting LearnHowToQuilt.com. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking on the Ohio star in the lower right-hand corner.